One old couple owned a donkey and cart, which they used to carry their vegetables, eggs and honey to the market town, and sometimes hired out at 6p a day to their neighbours. One house was occupied by a retired farm bailiff, who was reported to have well feathered his own nest during his years of stewardship. Another aged man owned and worked upon about an acre of land. These, the innkeeper, and one other man, a stonemason who walked the 3 miles to and from his work in the town every day, were the only ones not employed as agricultural labourers. Some of the cottages had 2 bedrooms, others only 1, in which case it had to be divided by a screen or curtain to accommodate parents and children. Often the big boys of a family slept downstairs or were put out to sleep in the 2nd bedroom of an elderly couple whose own children were out in the world. Except at holiday times, there were no big girls to provide for, as they were all out in service. Still, it was often a tight fit, for children swarmed, 8, 10, or even more in some families, and although they were seldom all at home together, the eldest often being married before the youngest was born, beds and shakedowns were often so closely packed that the inmates had to climb over one bed to get into another. But Lark Rise must not be thought of as a slum set down in the country. The inhabitants lived an open-air life. The cottages were kept clean by much scrubbing with soap and water, and doors and windows stood wide open when the weather permitted. When the wind cut across the flat land to the east, or came roaring down from the north, doors and windows had to be closed. But then, as the hamlet people said, they got more than enough fresh air through the keyhole. There were 2 epidemics of measles during the decade, and 2 men had accidents in the harvest field and were taken to hospital. But for years together, the doctor was only seen there when one of the ancients was dying of old age, or some difficult first confinement baffled the skill of the old woman who, as she said, saw the beginning and end of everybody. There was no cripple or mental defective in the hamlet, and except for a few months, when a poor woman was dying of cancer, no invalid. Though food was rough and teeth were neglected, indigestion was unknown, while nervous troubles, there as elsewhere, had yet to be invented. The very word nerve was used in a different sense to the modern one. "My word, and haven't she got a nerve?" they would say of anyone who expected more than was reasonable. In nearly all the cottages there was but 1 room downstairs, and many of these were poor and bare, with only a table and a few chairs and stools for furniture, and a superannuated potato sack thrown down by way of hearthrug. Other rooms were bright and cosy, with dressers of crockery, cushioned chairs, pictures on the walls, and brightly coloured handmade rag rugs on the floor. In these there would be pots of geraniums, fuchsias and old-fashioned sweet-smelling musk on the window-sills. In the older cottages there were grandfathers' clocks, gate-legged tables, and rows of pewter, relics of a time when life was easier for country folk. The interiors varied, according to the number of mouths to be fed and the thrift and skill of the housewife, or the lack of those qualities. But the income in all was precisely the same, for 10 shillings a week was the standard wage of the farm labourer at that time in that district. Looking at the hamlet from a distance, one house would have been seen a little apart and turning its back on its neighbours, as though about to run away into the fields. It was a small grey stone cottage with a thatched roof, a green-painted door, and a plum tree trained up the wall to the eaves. This was called the end house, and was the home of the stonemason and his family. At the beginning of the decade there were 2 children, Laura, aged 3, and Edmund, a year and a half younger. In some respects, these children, while small, were more fortunate than their neighbours. Their father earned a little more money than the labourers. Their mother had been a children's nurse, and they were well looked after. They were taught good manners and taken for walks. Milk was bought for them, and they were bathed regularly on Saturday nights, and after gentle Jesus was said, were tucked up in bed with the peppermint or clove ball to suck. They had tidier clothes too, for their mother had taste and skill with her needle, and better-off relations sent them parcels of outgrown clothes.